When I started to run CAFCASS in 2004, children in private law cases, that's children affected by separation and divorce, were really second-class citizens in the family justice system compared to children in care. But as time went on, over the last 15 years, we realized that those children had just a greater set of needs, particularly because of the emotional harm they were suffering, as children in public care. And gradually over that 15 years, the caseload we had increased to, by the time I finished last year, 140,000. Now that's a fraction of the number of children affected seriously by separation and divorce in England and in the United Kingdom. In fact, having looked at jurisdictions globally, it's a worldwide issue. It crosses classes, cultures, continents, and individuals. It can happen to anyone, but it tends to happen to those who don't handle conflict as well and don't handle anger and emotional boundaries as well. For children, it's a game changer, a life changer. Hundreds of thousands of adults in the UK today are walking around bearing the invisible scars of this conflict in the home when they were growing up. The pain never completely goes away. When I chaired a national adoption organisation, we were still getting people in their 80s and 90s coming to us trying to establish what happened to them with their parents when they were little. This isn't a quick fix. You can be perfectly normal and balanced as an adult, and yet intermittently at times have extreme difficulty because of the parental separation you went through. So the impact is lifelong, and it can be an emotional straitjacket. We understand much more now about what children are going through. Back then, certainly 15 years ago, 25 years ago, children were objectified, really. They were chattels, part of the possessions in a split. And when it came to which parent they saw, it tended to be sorted out between lawyers as bargaining chips at the courtroom door. And we've come a long way now to having to understand what an individual child is going through and the impact of conflict on them as individuals. So you can't classify conflict as high or low. It might be to the adults. That doesn't necessarily mean it's high or low to the children in the same order. It could be low conflict that's extremely high for the child concerned. It took us quite some time, and that work continues, to get closer to children. Understandably, children don't have the confidence, the vocabulary, the emotional concepts and expression to tell you exactly what they're going through. So you have to use tools, drawings, to find out, as well as spend time patiently with children. After all, why would you tell your life story to a complete stranger? And you don't really understand. A professional wants to be your friend and not a complete stranger. They are to you, especially if you're 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, before you can really understand it, very much someone to be afraid of the repercussions. So to find out what children are going through does need expert testimony, usually from children who grow up to be adults and then tell their stories, which is why Patricia Riley's book is so important, because those stories in detail and depth tell you much more than the statistics or the data. By the time I left CAFCASS last year, we were incorporating children's writings and drawings into our court reports. They'd come down from about 100 pages on average to 10, and we started with the child and stayed with the child and tried to tell their story. So that when a parent said, well, this is what happened, we tended to say, we'd rather listen to your child and hear about your dispute through the voice or whatever your child is expressing in terms of their behavior. That's much more reliable evidence than you saying why you've split up and what mattered to you. Because for many of the adults, they're trying to move on in their lives. That's understandable, especially with serious serial marriages, blended families. But for children, their parents are parents for life. They can't suddenly become divorced and move on. Sometimes, of course, they do. Children are happily part of blended families as well, but not entirely forgetting their original family. So it's crucial in these cases to understand the child impact of separation and divorce. As our work developed, we came to understand more some of the risks from abuse, some of the risks from neglect, particularly of hidden harm, favoritism, and so on, and some of the risks from parental alienation. And I wanted to spend a little bit of time with that because it features in Patricia's excellent book. But parental alienation was the subject of huge debates in the profession about did it exist or not. And in the end, we decided to say, first, it existed because it was obvious it did. You only had to look at how children were feeling and behaving to know that. But secondly, the diagnosis or the term, the label, mattered far less than what was happening to the children involved. And it came to be seen by us as a form of emotional abuse. The dissing, the distancing of one parent by the other, the attempt by one parent to eliminate the other from their child's identity and consciousness, the promotion of fake news about the other parent, news that was simply untrue, but was given to the child as gospel. And in that same syndrome, the systematic destruction of the identity of the other parent. So for the child, leaving the child utterly abandoned and confused emotionally. So what I would just like to conclude by saying before passing to Pat is that I'm going to say her book, The Serpent Child, is squarely in the contemporary mainstream. It's a memoir, but it's not about life 40 or 50 years ago. It's about life now for too many children. To have stories in depth, also told with the benefits of personal and professional experience and some distance, makes for textbook reading. In her book, Pat has been able to transport herself back decades to tell exactly what it was like to live with intensive parental conflict, to be turned into a child soldier, to be weaponized for far too many years. Over to you, Patricia.
Thank you, Anthony. Let me tell you about my parents. They were both very strong-willed. They'd both been married before, and by the time I was born, their relationship was already sadly terminally rocky. In fact, it had only lasted as long as it had because my father was away a lot during the war. It survived barely a year once we got into peacetime. And inevitably unable to agree on the arrangements for my care after they separated, my parents headed off to the High Court to get their battle settled. The judge listened to them giving their evidence, each trying to prove the other was an unfit parent. And the judge then gave his decision as I waited outside the court wondering what was going to happen to me. He decided that I should spend half my holidays with one parent and half with the other. And for the rest of my entire childhood, I must be educated in boarding schools. I was 7 years old. And as you can imagine, I was absolutely terrified. But this was the High Court. He was a High Court judge. Nothing could be done. What he said went. And so it was that I found myself staying for the first time in the boarding house where the father that I hardly knew now lived. And I'm now going to read you the story from my book of the first night that I spent there. And I'll have to put my glasses on, otherwise I won't be able to read a thing. My mother had told me that without fail, after I went to bed, I must get up after a while and go and tell my father that I was unhappy and that I wanted to go home. She said that I must do that because that would be evidence. She could tell the court that I didn't want to go and stay with my father, that I'd pleaded to be taken home, and that I was frightened of him. But when she told me to do that, she hadn't known it would mean me walking along a corridor full of noises and shadows in order to get to where my father was. And I hadn't known that either. The low wattage bulb shining at the back of the bookshelf at the head of my bed shed a tiny aura of rose-coloured light into the room. But all the boxes that were stored in the room, they now projected strange shaped shadows onto the walls behind them, and I quickly wriggled back down under the covers, just leaving enough space to look out at the room over the top of the sheet. As well as the glow from the little bulb behind me, a narrow shaft of golden light was visible, shining across the carpet through the door from the corridor outside. It wasn't much, but it did break up the darkness a little. Down the corridor I could hear voices and laughter coming from the room at the far end from my father's, from John Spence's room, my father had said, the one who'd lent the room for me to use when I came to stay with my father. I listened for a while and decided what I could hear must be a radio program, as every now and again there was laughter and applause. It was good to hear a familiar sound like that. It made that big, spooky boarding house less frightening somehow, hearing a radio. The thought of getting up out of my bed, walking along the corridor to my father's room and asking him to take me home, though, that was just too much. I couldn't do it. What would he say? Would he be angry? I knew he wouldn't take me home anyway, so my only reason for doing it would be because my mother had told me to. What if I didn't do as she asked? When I went back home, I could say I'd been too scared. But I knew if I did that, she'd look at me with a hurt face and say that I hadn't helped her with getting the evidence to go back to the court, and that must mean I didn't want to be with her as much as she wanted to be with me. And she'd probably go on to ask me if that meant I liked being with my father more than I liked being with her because of all the presents my father always gave me. This was something that she often said, even when he lived with us and afterwards, after when he visited. And it wasn't fair. I mean, why shouldn't I like my father giving me presents? Everybody likes having presents. It didn't mean I didn't love her or want to be with her. It was just nice to get presents. I was getting very tired now, as well as worried. I turned on my right side towards where I could see the little shaft of golden light on the floor by the door, but lying in a different position didn't stop me thinking. What was I going to do? Thinking in the dark is harder than thinking in the daytime, even for grown-ups. In the dark, nothing makes sense in the same way. Would it be the same if I told my father tomorrow morning that I wanted to go home? But that wasn't what my mother had told me to do. She told me I had to do this the first night because that's when people would expect a child away from home to get upset. Couldn't make up my mind what to do, except to be sure that I couldn't face walking right now along that corridor. It was a house full of strangers, and any of them might be going in and out of the great big block of bathrooms at any time, and it was right opposite my bedroom door. Deciding what to do was like trying to do a jigsaw in the dark when you can't see the pieces or how they fit together. In the day, you can make out the whole of the picture and it's easy to see the way to go, but after dark, there are shadows and questions and everything looks scarily different. Whatever I did, I couldn't please my mother without risking being in trouble with my father, and what if he got angry? I lay there, hugging Barbara, looking at the dark areas in this little room and then back at the light by the door and hoping none of the dark shapes in the room would have moved by the time I looked back at them. If they moved, it would mean something alive was in there, something alive in that room other than me. perhaps if I stayed absolutely still, if there was something alive in the room, it wouldn't know I was there. So I lay absolutely still till I could do so no longer, and I just had to move. When I did so, I could feel the sweat on the sheet, outlining the shape of my body where I'd been lying. First it was hot and damp, and then it gradually went cold. In the end, in the middle of being afraid of the dark and worrying about what to do next, I fell asleep. But it couldn't have been all that long before I found myself awake again. I don't know whether there was a noise that roused me or a dream, but the moment I woke up, I knew it must be quite late. The only light now was from the rose-coloured bulb by my head. The light in the corridor outside my room had been switched off, and the little shaft of golden light across the carpet from the door was gone. There was no more noise coming from John Spence's room either. The huge boarding house with all its residents was completely silent. I realised with a stab of guilt that I'd gone to sleep, and that meant I'd let my mother down by not doing what she wanted. With no light outside now, it was going to be even harder to go and ask my father to take me home. I should have done it before. And if I had, it wouldn't have been half as hard as it was going to be now. In the middle of thinking that, I found myself getting up out of the bed, even though I didn't think I'd made up my mind to do anything. I crept quietly through the bedroom door, still not sure what I was going to do, and looked along the corridor in both directions, hugging Barbara Bear tightly. Now that my eyes had adjusted to the darkness, I could see the door to my father's sitting room, and I walked towards it. It seemed dazzlingly light in there when I opened the door and went into the room from the dark corridor. My father was sitting on the settee in his dressing gown and pyjamas, having a drink and reading the paper. He didn't see me at first, but as I came round the side of the settee towards him, he must have heard something. He looked up. "I want to go home," I said. I didn't have to pretend to be scared. I want to go home," I said again. My father put the paper down and gestured to me to come and sit beside him. "You were asleep just now," he said. "I came to check, and you were asleep. Did you have a bad dream? I hope I didn't wake you." "No," I said, "but I want to see my mother. I want to go home." He reached over, pulled me closer to him, and took my hand in his. I wanted to pull my hand away, but I didn't dare. "You have two homes now, not just one," said my father, "and I want you with me. It makes me sad not to see you. You know I love you, don't you? You're my little girl too, as well as your mother's little girl." His voice sounded bitter when he said the words, "your mother." I didn't know what I was supposed to say to that, and in the end I said again the only thing I'd been told to say, "But I want to go home." "This is your home," said my father. "One of two homes. One home is with your mother and one is with me, and from now on you're going to spend time with both of us." He reached round and took hold of my other hand too. With him holding both my hands, I couldn't hold on to Barbara any longer, and she fell off my lap onto the floor. "You don't want to hurt me and make me feel really sad by saying you don't want to be here, do you?" my father asked. "We always had fun together, didn't we? And I have lots of plans for your Christmas holiday. Do you want to know what they are?" "I don't know," I said, looking down at Barbara Bear. I wanted to pick her up off the floor, but I couldn't because my father was holding to both my hands. Barbara didn't like being on the floor. I wondered what my mother would have wanted me to do now. She wasn't here to tell me. And I didn't remember my father ever saying before to me that he loved me or that he'd be hurt if I didn't want to be with him. Was that true? My mother had said he didn't love me and had never loved me because he'd wanted a boy, not a girl. But what if he did love me after all? And was hurt, like he said, when I asked to go home. I looked at him and thought he looked sad. I felt sorry then. I didn't want to hurt him. I didn't want to hurt anybody. But then I thought again about it and realized what he said couldn't be right. My mother wouldn't have told me something that wasn't true. So how could that be then? They couldn't both be right. I couldn't make sense of it. Well, now you've heard the extract from my book, Serpent Child. You know what Anthony meant when he was talking about parental alienation. He meant the deliberate programming of a child by one parent to get it to reject the other parent. I find it mind-blowing that some authorities say parental alienation either doesn't exist or if it does, it's very rare. I bet most of you have heard people bad-mouthing an ex-partner in front of their children. Teachers, for example, tell me they hear that at the school gates all the time. Parental alienation rare? I only wish it was. I made up my mind to write Serpent Child when I was 14. I wanted to shame the government into changing the law to protect children like me. But if I'd written it then, it would have been a very angry book, showing little understanding of my parents, and people would have just dismissed what I was saying. I knew that. I knew it had to wait until I was ready to write it, ready emotionally. And then people wouldn't say, oh, she's just a child. What does she know? I've always loved writing, but tackling this book as an adult was very different from creating my 8 murder mystery plays and researching for Looking for Geetha, my biography of early 20th century feminist playwright Geetha Sowerby. Telling my own story, that was tough, very tough, because it meant reliving my childhood, but with the understanding that adult life experience has given me. And I can tell you it hurt, but it was worth it. I now understand much better how my otherwise intelligent and articulate parents could have ended up using me as a handy weapon in the battle they both were obsessed with winning. It was a simple act of self-deception. They both told themselves they were acting in my best interests. And they weren't really doing that, of course. What they were doing was using me as a weapon and in the process tearing me apart. Perhaps if other warring parents read Serpent Child, it will help at least some of them to see that they're destroying any chance of a carefree childhood for the children that they say they love and believe they love. Perhaps too, those professionals who deny the existence of this kind of destructive parental behavior will be forced to admit that sadly, it isn't rare. It is not rare at all. This is my book, Serpent Child. It's in paperback, as you can see, and you can order it for £10 plus postage and packing from the website of independent publishers Stairwell Books of York, England, at www.stairwellbooks.co.uk. And if you want to know why I called the book Serpent Child, well, I'm not going to tell you now, so you're going to have to read it if you want to find out why and what happened in that story. I hope you decide to read it. I hope you'll do just that. Thank you for listening.